Hey guys, it's Celestia, and today we're gonna talk about cringe. More specifically, because that unfortunately refers to a lot of different things, we're gonna talk about cringe art, and how cringe culture impacts the art community specifically. I think we've all seen many examples of it. Furry art being the butt of every joke, OC artists having their characters ripped to shreds for being too emo or edgy or overpowered, beginner artists' work being openly and shamelessly roasted in cringe compilations, and so much more. Cringe culture's impact on the art community is massive and undeniable at this point. And unfortunately, it seems like it's getting worse, not better. With platforms like TikTok popularizing trends of bullying artists whose art doesn't meet socially accepted standards, be that in terms of quality or subject matter, and a multitude of YouTube channels devoted to mocking compilations of cringe art, it's not surprising that the problem is worsening. So in this video, I want to talk about why. What makes certain types of art more cringe than others? Why are people so quick to laugh at and demean the work of other artists? And why is this such a big problem for artists specifically more so than others? We're gonna go over all of that in a minute here to hopefully bring attention to these problems. But first, let me take a moment to thank today's sponsor, Skillshare. Every time I get to work with Skillshare is honestly a dream come true, because as I've mentioned before, I learned everything I needed to start my channel on Skillshare, and having the opportunity to work with and promote the platform that helped me start my business and change my life is validating and exciting beyond words. If you somehow don't know, Skillshare is an online learning platform with courses on literally anything you could possibly want to learn. And in my opinion, as someone who has spent the last 2 years using those courses to learn everything from video editing to illustration techniques to webcomic development, it's the best platform out there to help anyone turn their creativity and passion into a career. Doing so often means needing to learn a million new skills that you didn't expect to need, and it can be really overwhelming if you don't know where to start. Skillshare is where, and it will make your life so much easier. You need to learn how to market your art, figure out a new drawing software, get better at drawing anatomy. They have a class for all of that and more. In terms of creative careers, they even have a Skillshare curated list of courses designed to help you grow yours. My favorite of which is Going Freelance, Building and Branding Your Own Success by Justin Guignac, which I would very much recommend to anyone trying to turn their creative passions into independent careers, because it goes over everything from building a good portfolio to effectively marketing your work and everything in between. Others I've personally taken and found helpful are Adobe Premiere Pro Essentials Training Course by Daniel Scott, which taught me how to make my videos, and Character Illustration, Drawing Faces, Figures, and Clothing by Gabriel Piccolo, which helped me so much with making my poses less stiff. All of these will be linked in the description, so please go check them out if you're interested. Speaking of links in the description, the first 1,000 of you to click the first one there will be able to get a full month free trial of Skillshare, giving you access to not only the courses I mentioned already, but their entire library. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that in that month, you'll have the resources and information to take your work to the next level, no matter what that looks like for you. So please go click that link and see for yourself. Thank you so much to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. They really do make learning fun, easy, and accessible, so please go check them out. All that aside, let's get into the video. What is cringe culture? To put it simply, it's the practice of mocking content that someone, or the majority of a group of people, finds embarrassing, bad, or shameful. But to say that it's just mocking content that falls into that category is a little reductive, because that's really not all it is. More often than not, it's mocking the individuals creating or enjoying that content, effectively meaning that cringe culture is basically just another word for targeted bullying and harassment. The groups that are targeted the most are generally those with interests that are deemed too childish, too mainstream, or that they're quote-unquote too interested in. We'll go more into that later because that in and of itself is a lot to unpack. But before we do, let's talk about how the popularization of cringe culture is affecting the art community specifically, because there's way more to discuss under the umbrella topic of cringe for me to discuss in a reasonable amount of time, and I'd like to keep this relevant to artists in particular. In the art community, cringe culture is most obviously seen on platforms like TikTok, where people will gather and share compilations of art they deem cringeworthy, publicly mocking and demeaning it for the sake of exceptionally cheap comedy. And that's definitely the most well-known example because it has unfortunately stood the test of time. Yes, TikTok is now one of the newest and most popular ways for the terminally online to mock art they consider cringe, but the practice existed long before it did, and in fundamentally the same way. Starting in 2012, the term cringe began its steady rise in Google search terms, and while it peaked around 2017 or so with a little bit of a downturn afterwards, it has once again returned to its upward trend, a clear indication indication of its consistent and growing presence and popularity within online spaces. And art has always been an easy target for those who enjoy that trend, long before YouTube and now TikTok adapted that mockery to a video format. Formerly seen in things like Facebook groups dedicated to scraping the worst, cringiest art from DeviantArt to share and laugh at, for example. These compilations have always existed and are absolutely one of the earliest and longest standing ways we can see cringe culture hurt the art community. But that's not the only method. We also have to look at the subgroups of the art community, because cringe culture is responsible for making them all so polarized and isolated from each other. What I mean is that because entire interests, genres, and styles of art are frequently deemed cringe, rather than just individual pieces of art, artists who draw anything that falls into that category are cast out from the wider community and thoroughly demeaned, even by other artists and members of fandom. That's resulted in the alienation of entire communities of artists, who have been effectively forced to form completely separate, isolated sub-communities of their own with limited interaction with the wider art community as a whole. Sometimes this is based on fandom, sometimes on style, sometimes on the level of interest they have in what they're drawing in and of itself. But ultimately the result is that they don't feel welcome in spaces where all artists should, all because of cringe. But the question remains, why? What makes those artists' work cringe? Well, the reasons generally fall into three main categories: skill, characters, and content. Skill is the most obvious and common one. Beginner artists' work is constantly and relentlessly mocked for being cringe, all because it had the audacity to be posted to the internet despite containing anatomical errors or unpopular stylistic choices. The belief driving this is that they should be embarrassed to post it at all, and it's subsequently embarrassing secondhand and also super funny that they were proud to instead. And hands down, the biggest motivator for this instance of cringe culture's prevalence, in my opinion, is insecurity. If you feel bad about the quality of your own art, deliberately seeking out work that's worse than your own is likely going to make you feel better about it. To do so privately is one thing. Whether or not it's helpful is its own question, but that's irrelevant. Regardless, it's another entirely to participate in the outward public mockery of it, too. Whether that be by actively contributing to it or just by consuming, supporting, and further popularizing it. Either way, you're punishing and alienating beginner artists for nothing more than the unforgivable crime of being beginners, and that's so beyond ridiculous and unacceptable to me. That's not the only way the artist's work itself might result in it being called cringe, though. Style faces just as much scrutiny. Fiona Paulo made an excellent video going over the inherent biases that artists and consumers alike have towards or against certain styles, which I'll link in the iCard above. But what's relevant to this point is that based on generalization and ignorance, certain art styles are criticized more than others for completely baseless reasons. This can take many forms, one of which, as I'm sure you can guess, is those styles being seen as cringe. The most well-known examples I've seen are the so-called Cal Art style, the so-called Tumblr style that's impossible to even really objectively define, the Gacha lifestyle, the anime style altogether, at least by society as a whole, although less so by artists and members of fandom, and any style with a lot of clashing, neon colors that can be even vaguely interpreted as emo or scene, which is an aesthetic that in and of itself is instantly written off as cringe by the majority of humanity. I've also seen individual artist styles being demeaned simply because they're popular and commonly seen, like the ridiculous number of people saying things like, "Oh, they're just another lowish clone, that's so cringe." Regardless of the individual style being mocked, though, the bottom line is that style alone is subject to mockery through cringe culture just as much as skill. Whether the way you draw is too simple, too exaggerated, too popular, or too niche, there is always going to be someone who says it's cringe as a result. It all comes down to herd mentality and the desire to fit in that's been deeply ingrained in the majority of society, which I'll get into more later because that's a sentiment that really applies to all of this. But the next category of art that's often labeled cringe is characters. And I don't mean in terms of fandom, because that's the third category that I'll get into next. This art isn't seen as cringe because of what the characters are from, it's seen as cringe because of who they are and what they represent. Three primary examples come to mind: self-inserts, Mary Sue's, and OCX canon, or original characters shipped with canon characters. Art of these characters is mocked largely because the idea of liking a thing so much that you want to insert yourself into it, even in a fictional capacity through your art, is looked down on, bringing us to that central focus once again on it not just being what you like that's cringe, it's how much you like it. That's another thing I'm gonna come back to and unpack later, just you wait. Original characters and Mary Sue's may not actually be self-inserts, but critics of them are quick to say that they may as well be, and are just self-inserts disguised as original characters to be more socially acceptable. As a result, all OCs are often met with the same scrutiny as self-inserts, with some ridiculous pressure being put on their artists to prove that they're not like other OCs, they're not self-inserts, they're not cringe. If your character can in any way be interpreted as possessing qualities that you also possess or want to possess, it's cringe in the eyes of many, and drawing that OC as a result is even more cringe, especially if you do so often. Finally, the last category, content. The subject matter of your art alone alone can be enough to warrant its mockery as being cringe, most often seen in cases of fan art for cringe-worthy fandoms. Examples of this are Gacha Life, My Little Pony, Sonic the Hedgehog, and Five Nights at Freddy's, to name a few. And in these cases, the reason it's seen as cringe is almost always because those fandoms are deemed childish, and it's cringe to like childish things. The majority of artists facing criticism in this regard are adults, because far too many people consider adults liking anything remotely childish as weird or shameful. But there are absolutely still cases of literal children being called cringe for enjoying and drawing fan art of childish subject matter, creating this unnecessary and downright harmful pressure for them to be mature long before they should ever have to. It also basically puts an age limit on interests, which is ridiculous in and of itself. This category also pertains to things like furry art, which is also deemed cringe by way of subject matter alone, largely because of false assumptions made about an entire community of people based on its loudest and weirdest members. Most people who enjoy cringe culture do so because they take the art they're seeing at face value, judging it on first impressions alone. And the first impression most people have of furries is based on what they've heard about the most outrageous and extreme examples of them. This is something I've seen a lot within cringe culture as a whole. Like, entire fandoms, styles, and genres of art are being judged by the worst possible examples of them, because the worst examples are often the most well-known. Unhinged furry jailed for trying to be intimate with a dog is a headline that gets your attention even if that furry represents 0.1% of the community itself. Regular artists create and enjoy anthropomorphic humanoid characters is a headline that does not get your attention, even if that's actually what the other 99% of the community is like. Fandoms like Undertale and Five Nights at Freddy's also face similar biases, and honestly, that's the case for the majority of cringe culture as a whole. So now that we've gone over the most prominent examples of how cringe culture impacts artists specifically, let's talk about why. What motivates the ones doing the mocking? We've already established that when it comes to mocking art based on skill, it's usually based out of insecurity. These are people who feel bad about their own art, and them mocking artists whose work is worse, while still deeply unacceptable, is less out of genuine malice and more out of a desire to feel better about their own art by proving that theirs is better. There are other instances in which insecurity might also be to blame though, even if it's for different reasons. For example, someone mocking an artist drawing fan art of a cringe fandom might actually like that fandom themselves, but because it's seen as cringe, they don't let themselves express it or enjoy it publicly. Which brings me to the much bigger underlying issue, the one that motivates not only cringe culture, but that insecurity itself: conformity. More specifically, the deep-rooted fear of standing out from the crowd that's hammered into all of us by society, because standing out and being different makes you a target. We're taught, consciously and subconsciously, that anything that sets us apart from our peers in any significant way, aside from excelling past them at something, is bad, and that most definitely extends to our interests and our art. There's a part in most, or maybe even all of us, that's scared of liking things that others look down on, much less drawing it, and it's much easier to just hide those interests or repress them altogether than it is to open yourself up to being one of those people that's mocked and looked down on as cringe. And the problem with that isn't just that artists everywhere are afraid to draw and enjoy what they want and instead end up pretending to only have socially acceptable interests. It's also that they're so afraid of being the targets that they'll go along with the harassment of others instead, just to avoid being in their position. People are so afraid of being bullied that they're willing to be the bully instead. If one artist is being shamed for drawing cringe fan art of their OC, that means the ones doing the shaming aren't having their own art scrutinized. So much of cringe culture comes from the desperation to not be the one being cringed at, which is incredibly discouraging and sad, because it means more often than not, even the ones participating in cringe culture don't even believe it's cringe. They just know it's not acceptable to like or enjoy, so they pretend they don't. And them pretending they don't only reinforces the acceptance of the idea that they shouldn't. If we could all just like what we like without worrying what anyone else thinks about it, no interests would be cringe, no art would be cringe, and artists could just be free to create whatever they want. Instead, we're trapped by our own fear and motivated by it to perpetuate the exact same culture that caused it to begin with. It doesn't help that this herd mentality is exacerbated infinitely more by the growing prominence of trend following, with it becoming more and more normal to just attack, harass, and bully others because everyone else is doing it, and people jump on those bandwagons without a second thought. That said, fear, insecurity, and conformity aren't the only motivators for cringe culture. I would be doing a massive disservice not to mention its roots in ableism, too. See, the basis of cringe itself is secondhand embarrassment. People mock things they think are embarrassing and shameful, and they determine what is and isn't embarrassing based on the collective understanding of the social norms society has accepted as correct. Anything that breaks those social norms is immediately slapped with the label of cringe and mocked, which leaves artists who don't have a strong understanding of those social norms at an unbelievably significant disadvantage. And you know what group of people struggles to understand and conform to social norms? Neurodivergent people. And if you look at the specific groups of artists that are falling victim to cringe culture, you'll notice the one thing they all have in common: that either the thing they like or the way they like it breaks the social social norm. This is particularly troubling for people on the spectrum, who often have very niche interests that they hyperfixate on, immediately opening them up to being targeted by cringe culture, which hinges upon exactly that. It's cringe to like something that's childish or quote-unquote age inappropriate? Well, neurodivergent people, particularly those on the spectrum, don't have the same understanding of what's age appropriate as neurotypical people do, because the definition of what is age appropriate is redundantly and meaninglessly determined by social norms. So a significant number of them do have interests that others might consider to be childish. It's cringe to like something to the point of obsession and get really into it to the point of making lots of fan art or OCs? Well, that's exactly the kind of hyperfixation that comes with having a special interest, something that often goes hand in hand with neurodivergence. Every aspect of cringe culture puts neurodivergent artists at a disadvantage, setting them up to be the targets of it more than anyone else. And I say that with the personal experience of being a neurodivergent artist that's on the spectrum and is 25 with so-called childish special interests like Animal Crossing and Ape Escape. It's impossible to talk about cringe culture in the art community without acknowledging the inherent ableism at its core, because there's just no denying that whether people are consciously aware of it or not, that is what's at its core. So where does that leave us? We can talk all day about what cringe culture looks like in the art community and what motivates it, but it's much more important to discuss how much harm it's doing and how that harm can be mitigated. Every single category of artists targeted by cringe culture that I talked about today is hurt by it in a different way. Neurodivergent artists are set up to have their special interests held against them, all because they had the audacity to like something that others thought that they shouldn't more than they thought they should. Beginner artists are held to impossible standards because art that doesn't meet certain standards for skill is cringe, but they can't improve their art enough for it not to be without being bullied into quitting first. Unlike the generation before them that was encouraged to be cringe and post whatever they wanted to draw on DeviantArt with other artists who liked those same things, young artists now are instead being raised watching that art get roasted on TikTok, taught to fear making art that's included in the next compilation. All artists are forced to filter the things they actually want to draw through the lens of whether or not those things are socially acceptable or embarrassing. And so art as an entire medium suffers, because only art with popular, not cringe, widely accepted subject matter and styles will get attention, leading to the utter stagnation of creativity. Cringe culture's impact on the art community is exclusively negative, only serving to cause harm, with the only possible benefit being that it's, what, kind of funny to laugh at people? Find real comedy! Stop with this! Ultimately, there's nothing any one of us can do to stop cringe culture, but there are things that we can do as individuals at the very least to stand up against it. We can talk about it and bring attention to why it's bad, we can stand up for the artists who are being targeted by it, we can let ourselves like the things that we like and draw what we want, and encourage our peers to do the same, and we can be more conscious of the way that we engage with content. For me personally, I didn't even realize the ways I was contributing to cringe culture without even noticing. So much of it is so internalized for so many of us that it's not at all uncommon to be entirely unaware of the ways that it manifests. Like making fun of my old OC from when I was 12 for being an edgy scene girl with swept bangs and neon clothes and red eyes might make some other 12-year-old out there think they're dumb for making an OC like that, even if making them would have made them really happy. Hell, when I made that OC, it made me really happy, and I don't regret it at all. The last thing I want to do is take that away from any young artist that might be listening to me flippantly insult myself for ever having done so. Making 2 videos laughing about the ridiculous things posted on r/delusional artists seemed funny and harmless to me at the time, but once I really thought about what message I was sending with those videos in terms of cringe culture, I didn't like it, and I will not be continuing that series. There's a little bit of cringe culture in all of us, and in my opinion, it's important that we try to be as introspective and conscious of that as possible so that we can try to fight against it instead, for our sake and the sakes of others. There was one post I read that put it better than I possibly could. Don't kill the part of you that's cringe, kill the part of you that cringes. And I think that's a good sentiment to leave this video on. Go draw your Mary Sue Sonic OC with their emo clothes and their eyes that change color with their mood, and have a good time doing it, because you having a good time is literally all that matters. Don't let anyone take that away from you. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and thank you for watching. Special thank you as always to channel members Cafe Soleil, Joseph Solomon, Art of Amethyst Fable, and TC Pratt, as well as patrons Batman, Kyle Lowe, Blue Swanson, Cora Fear, Elengshi, Soul Crystal, Kim Yen, Shamil Sheep, Crazy Hassar, Gen Tong, Jacobus Peterson, Grayson Xavier, Ty Finch 94, Milk Bean, Eeyore Hiha, MG, Eclectrica, Blahmage, TC Pratt, Finn, Grim Spectre, Stephen Jett, and Theobald Leonhardt for their support, and I'll see you in the next one.